Consider this carefully before anything else. What you call disturbance does not arrive with events. It appears only after you decide that something should not have happened, or that it means more than it does. The noise, the delay, the comment, the loss, none of these carry agitation within them. They are facts. They occur. They pass. What remains is your judgment about them. This is not a comforting idea. It removes the familiar refuge of blaming circumstances, other people, or bad timing. It places responsibility exactly where it belongs, with you. Not with your emotions, not with your past, not with the situation, but with the judgment you allow to stay. Events are neutral. They have no opinion about you. They do not insult you, disrespect you, or threaten your worth. Those interpretations are added afterward. Often quickly. Often without notice. And once added, they are defended as if they were facts. This is why disturbance lingers. Not because something happened, but because a judgment was accepted and then revisited, repeated, and protected. You replay it. You justify it. You carry it forward. At no point is this forced upon you. Nothing here asks you to suppress feeling or deny difficulty. It asks you to recognize where authority truly lies. Responsibility cannot be outsourced. If disturbance remains, it is because you have granted it residence. Hold this distinction. Disturbance persists through accepted judgment. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. You become disturbed when you treat what is not yours as if it were under your authority. This confusion is subtle, but it shapes nearly every frustration you experience. Effort is poured into places where effort has no effect, and responsibility is avoided where it actually belongs. What belongs to you is narrow, but it is sufficient. Your judgments are yours. Your intentions are yours. Your choices, refusals, and responses belong to you. No one can take these unless you hand them over. This is the full extent of your authority, and it is enough for a disciplined life. What does not belong to you is far broader than most people are willing to admit. The behavior of others is not yours. Outcomes are not yours. Reputation, timing, approval, results, and circumstances do not answer to you. You may influence some of them indirectly, but influence is not ownership. Treating influence as control is where frustration begins. Consider a simple example. You prepare carefully for a conversation. You speak clearly. The other person reacts poorly. If you believe their reaction belongs to you, disturbance follows immediately. You replay your words. You try to manage their interpretation. You feel wronged by their response. None of this improves your authority. It only obscures it. Your responsibility ended with speaking honestly and reasonably. Their response was never yours to command. Or consider waiting. You expect a process to move quickly. It does not. If you treat the delay as a personal violation, irritation grows. You believe something owed to you has been withheld. But time does not owe you efficiency. Systems do not owe you convenience. The disturbance arises not from waiting, but from the judgment that waiting is unacceptable. This is why discipline often feels exhausting. People attempt to discipline outcomes. They attempt to discipline others. They attempt to discipline life itself. When this fails, they conclude that discipline is harsh, unrealistic, or unsustainable. The truth is simpler. Discipline collapses when it is aimed at the wrong target. The Stoic boundary of control is not pessimistic. It is precise. It removes unnecessary struggle. When you stop demanding authority where you have none, energy returns to where it can actually be used. You stop rehearsing arguments that will never be heard. You stop resenting conditions that will not change on command. You stop carrying responsibilities that were never assigned to you. This does not mean passivity. It means accuracy. You still act. You still plan. You still engage. But you do so without attaching your peace to factors outside your command. Action becomes cleaner. Effort becomes lighter. failure becomes informative rather than personal. Notice how often disturbance includes the phrase they should understand, they should respond differently, they should behave better. Each should placed on someone else is an attempt to relocate your authority. Each one creates tension, because reality does not comply. The discipline here is not to eliminate preference, but to remove confusion. You may prefer cooperation. You may prefer efficiency. You may prefer respect. Preference is natural. But preference does not grant ownership. When preference hardens into expectation, disturbance follows. Clarity restores balance. When you hold firmly to what is yours and release what is not, responsibility becomes manageable. You are no longer scattered across outcomes and opinions. You are centered on judgment and choice. This is the foundation. Without it, no further practice holds. This explains where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. Nothing enters your mind as a finished conclusion. What arrives first is an impression. A sound, a word, a delay, a facial expression. These impressions are automatic. You do not summon them. You do not prevent them. They appear, just as weather appears. At this stage, nothing is yet a problem. Disturbance begins only when you agree with an interpretation of that impression. This agreement is called assent. It is the moment you say, often silently, "This is bad. This is unfair," or "This should not be happening." The impression did not force this verdict. You supplied it. This distinction matters because impressions feel convincing. They arrive with urgency. They often carry emotion with them. But emotion is not agreement. Feeling irritation is not the same as deciding that something is intolerable. Feeling disappointment is not the same as concluding that you have been wrong. The Stoic error is not feeling. It is consenting too quickly. Consider criticism. Someone speaks a dismissive sentence. The impression arrives instantly. Tone, words, posture. Along with it comes a bodily response. Tightness, heat, readiness. None of this is yet disturbance. Disturbance appears when you assent to the judgment that you have been disrespected, diminished, or attacked. That judgment may feel justified, but justification is not the same as necessity. You could withhold agreement. You rarely do. Or consider delay. You expect progress. It does not come. The impression is simple, waiting. The disturbance forms when the mind adds, "This is unacceptable," or "My time is being wasted." Notice that waiting itself has not changed. Only the judgment has. Without that judgment, waiting is merely time passing. The crucial point is that assent is optional. It may not feel optional, but it is. Between impression and judgment, there is a moment. Often brief. Often unnoticed. But it exists. That moment is where freedom lies. Not in controlling impressions. Not in controlling outcomes. Only in controlling agreement. Most people miss this moment because they believe the first story the mind offers. The impression speaks, and the verdict follows so quickly that they seem fused. But they are not. With training, the separation becomes clear. You begin to see thoughts as proposals rather than commands. This is why telling yourself to stay calm rarely works. Calm is not produced by force. It is produced by accuracy. When you stop treating impressions as orders, intensity decreases on its own. The mind settles when it is no longer rushed into judgment. Notice also that assent can be withdrawn. Even after you agree too quickly, you can revise. You can say, "This is only an impression," or "I do not yet know what this means." Revision is not weakness. It is correction. Disturbance persists only as long as judgment is maintained. Many people believe their reactions are automatic. They are not. Feelings arise automatically. Agreement does not. The habit of assenting without examination creates the illusion of inevitability. Practice breaks that illusion. This does not mean hesitation in action. You can act decisively without assenting to unnecessary judgments. You can respond firmly without concluding that you are threatened. You can correct without condemning. Assent determines whether action is clean or agitated. Once you see this mechanism clearly, responsibility becomes precise. You stop arguing with impressions. You stop blaming emotions. You focus on the only point that matters, whether you agree. Understanding the mechanism is not enough. It must be trained. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They imagine discipline as force, as suppression, as gritting teeth and enduring discomfort until something breaks. Under this view, discipline is reactive. It appears only after disturbance has already taken hold, and it tries to overpower what should have been examined earlier. Stoic discipline is not force. It is training. It works before pressure arrives, not during collapse. It does not attempt to eliminate impressions or emotions. It prepares the mind to meet them without surrendering judgment. Training means repetition under manageable conditions. No one trains strength by attempting the heaviest weight first. No one trains balance by stepping immediately onto unstable ground. Yet this is how most people attempt mental discipline. They wait for intense situations and then demand perfect control. When they fail, they conclude that discipline is unrealistic. The Stoic approach is quieter. You train attention in small moments. You practice noticing impressions without reacting. You practice withholding assent when nothing urgent is at stake. Over time, the pause becomes familiar. When pressure increases, the habit remains. This is why willpower is unreliable. Willpower is episodic. It spikes and fades. Training is cumulative. It reshapes defaults. You do not rely on motivation to notice impressions. You rely on habit. Discipline also does not require emotional absence. Feeling irritation, disappointment, or anxiety is not failure. Failure occurs only when you treat these feelings as directives. Emotion says, act now. Discipline replies, wait. Not to suppress, but to see clearly. Consider how this applies to thought. A judgment appears, this is unacceptable. Training does not argue with it immediately. It does not panic. It notes the judgment and delays agreement. Often, the judgment weakens on its own when not reinforced. What seemed urgent loses its authority. This delay is not indecision. It is accuracy. You are choosing not to commit before evidence is complete. In this sense, discipline is a form of intellectual honesty. You refuse to grant certainty where none exists. Training also changes how you relate to mistakes. When you assent too quickly and become disturbed, the disciplined response is not self-criticism. It is review. You ask, where did I agree too fast? Not to condemn, but to refine attention. Each error becomes information. This removes drama from self-improvement. There is no need for punishment. No need for praise. Only adjustment. Discipline progresses through clarity, not intensity. Importantly, training must occur when stakes are low. You practice during minor inconveniences, brief delays, small misunderstandings. These moments are not interruptions. They are the training ground. If you wait for major challenges, training never stabilizes. Over time, something shifts. You no longer feel compelled to chase every impression. You notice thoughts as events rather than truths. The mind becomes less crowded. Not because life simplifies, but because fewer judgments are admitted without examination. This is not a personality change. It is a skill. Like any skill, it strengthens with use and weakens with neglect. No final state is reached. There is only maintenance. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Discipline does not require special conditions. It does not wait for silence, solitude, or ideal circumstances. It lives in the parts of the day you usually dismiss as insignificant. These are the moments where impressions arrive without warning and judgment is invited to rush ahead. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This does not mean expecting the worst. It means acknowledging reality accurately. You will encounter delay. You will encounter resistance. You will encounter misunderstanding. None of this is surprising. When you stop demanding that the day conform to preference, impressions lose their shock. You are not bracing yourself. You are orienting yourself. In the morning, you can state this plainly: today will include inconvenience. Not as a complaint. As a fact. This simple recognition weakens the force of later impressions. When delay arrives, it no longer feels like an injustice. It feels like what was already accounted for. The second practice is pausing before assent. This pause does not need to be dramatic. One breath is enough. A brief suspension of agreement is enough. When an impression appears and a judgment follows closely behind, you do not need to refute it. You only need to delay endorsing it. That breath creates space. In that space, you remember that impressions propose, they do not decide. You may still act. You may still respond. But you do so without the added weight of unnecessary judgment. Often, the intensity fades before the breath is finished. This practice works precisely because it is small. You are not trying to overhaul the mind. You are interrupting a reflex. Repetition matters more than strength. Each pause weakens the habit of immediate assent. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you look back calmly. You ask where judgment was handled well and where it was not. Not to congratulate. Not to punish. Only to observe. Guilt is itself an unexamined judgment. It adds a second layer of disturbance to the first. Praise is similar. It encourages attachment to outcomes rather than accuracy. Both distract from the point of review, which is learning. You might notice that you assented quickly during a conversation, or that you maintained clarity during an inconvenience. Both are information. One shows where attention slipped. The other shows that training is taking root. Neither requires emotional reaction. This review closes the day cleanly. You do not carry unresolved judgments into rest. You do not rehearse mistakes. You simply register them and release them. These practices are modest by design. They fit into ordinary life because ordinary life is where impressions occur. Discipline that requires special conditions is fragile. Discipline that operates during routine survives. Consistency matters more than intensity. A single breath practiced many times reshapes behavior more reliably than rare moments of heroic restraint. Over time, anticipation becomes natural. Pausing becomes familiar. Review becomes neutral. As this stabilizes, something subtle changes. You feel less urgency to correct, explain, or defend. Not because you care less, but because fewer judgments demand action. Life continues to present difficulty. But fewer difficulties become disturbances. This is not a performance. No one sees it. No one needs to. Discipline here is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is measured by what no longer escalates. When this practice becomes stable, a different kind of freedom appears. Freedom is often misunderstood. Many people imagine freedom as ease, as the absence of friction, as a life in which things go smoothly and others cooperate. Under this definition, freedom is fragile. It depends on conditions remaining favorable. When conditions change, freedom disappears. Stoic freedom is different. It does not promise comfort. It does not protect you from difficulty. It establishes something more durable, inner authority. The ability to remain sovereign over judgment regardless of circumstance. Life does not become easier when you practice this. Delays still occur. People still behave unpredictably. Loss and uncertainty remain. What changes is where disturbance is allowed to form. Authority returns inward. You stop negotiating your state of mind with the world. This is why freedom must be maintained rather than achieved. There is no finish line. Each impression still requires attention. Each judgment still invites assent. Freedom is preserved moment by moment through the same small acts of discipline that created it. Comfort and freedom are not the same. Comfort seeks conditions that feel good. Freedom requires only that judgment remains clear. Comfort is easily taken away. Freedom is not granted by circumstances and therefore cannot be revoked by them. When you understand this, you stop waiting for permission to be steady. You stop postponing calm until situations improve. Nothing outside you must change for this to begin. The work is internal, and it is available immediately. This does not make you indifferent. You still care. You still prefer certain outcomes. You still act. But preference no longer hardens into demand. When outcomes disappoint, disappointment does not become disturbance unless you allow it. Inner freedom also changes how you relate to others. You stop needing their behavior to confirm your composure. Praise does not elevate you. Criticism does not destabilize you. Both are received as impressions, examined, and either accepted or declined. This is not emotional numbness. Emotion continues to arise. The difference is that emotion no longer dictates agreement. You feel, but you do not surrender authority. That distinction is the essence of freedom. There is also humility here. You accept that perfection is not required. You will assent too quickly at times. You will become disturbed. Freedom is not lost permanently when this happens. It is restored the same way it was established, by returning judgment to its proper place. Maintenance is quiet. It does not announce success. It notices drift and corrects it, again and again, without resentment. This form of freedom cannot be taken from you by insult, delay, or loss. It can only be surrendered. And surrender happens through unnoticed assent, not through force. Nothing more needs to be added. This ends where responsibility begins. Nothing in this practice requires escalation, intensity, or struggle. It requires only accuracy. You are not asked to control life, remove emotion, or demand better circumstances. You are asked to notice where judgment enters, and whether you choose to let it stay. Disturbance does not persist because events are powerful. It persists because judgments are left unexamined. When you believe disturbance is imposed from the outside, you search endlessly for relief in the wrong places. When you see that disturbance is maintained internally, responsibility becomes clear. And with responsibility comes freedom. This freedom is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It appears quietly when something happens and you do not immediately agree with the story your mind offers. It appears when irritation arises and does not escalate. It appears when disappointment arrives and is allowed to pass without becoming accusation. You will not do this perfectly. Perfection is not required. Each day will include moments where assent happens too quickly and disturbance follows. That does not invalidate the practice. It defines it. The work is not to avoid error, but to return more quickly to what is yours. Nothing outside you must change for this to function. Not other people. Not circumstances. Not outcomes. The entire practice operates within the boundary you already possess. Judgment. Choice. Response. This is why responsibility cannot be outsourced. No one else can withhold assent for you. No one else can correct your judgment. This is not a burden. It is a clarification. The work belongs exactly where it can be done. Return to the pause. Return to what is yours. Practice this today in something small.